Moving on to the determination of the exchange rate in the long run, we have just studied the determination of the exchange rate in the short run, and we have seen that the models that we have at hand are useful, but they are not necessarily supported empirically in the extremely short run, which is what matters most to businesses as well as investors. So, moving on to the long run determination of the exchange rate, we call this the monetary approach because it uses certain monetary theory to determine the exchange rate in the long run. So, specifically, we asked three questions. In the long run, how does arbitrage in the goods market link purchasing power of currencies in the exchange rates? And second, how does the supply and demand for money affect the purchasing power of currencies? And third, given how these economic forces work, what factors might influence monetary and exchange rate choices made by policymakers? In other words, goods market arbitrage links purchasing power of currencies and their exchange rates, and the demand and supply for money has an effect on the purchasing power of currencies. And we will look at the interaction between goods market arbitrage on the one hand, as well as the monetary policy of a country, and see how that will impact the exchange rate. In short, the answer to how the exchange rate is determined in the long run is by traders conducting arbitrage in the market for goods. If they see that goods, once expressed in the same currency, have different prices in different locations, and if these differences in prices, the price wedge is large enough, there will be arbitrage, that is, some actors, economic agents, taking advantage of this price wedge to buy or sell in different locations, and over time bringing the prices closer together. And this is the idea of purchasing power parity, PPP, which is an important concept that we will learn about in this lecture. More specifically, the structure of this chapter is as follows. First, we look at the theory of purchasing power, PPP, which suggests that the exchange rate between two countries is pinned down by their price levels, relative price levels, in one country and another. And once we know that purchasing power can help us to determine the exchange rate in the long run, so PPP, purchasing power parity theory, suggests that the exchange rate is related to the price difference between two countries, the levels in their price levels. So if you like, the price levels will allow us to understand the exchange rate. We can then ask in the second step how the price levels are determined. And this will show that it is related to monetary conditions in each country and their relative levels between one country, home country, and abroad. And then we put these two things together to have a monetary approach to the exchange rate. It's called the monetary approach to the exchange rate because it suggests that the monetary policy conditions in a country will determine the price level, and then the price level using purchasing power parity will determine the exchange rate. So this part here uses the monetary theory of the price level. You can abbreviate it as MTP. And the second part, moving from price levels to exchange rates, is done by the purchasing power parity theory, which we will look at first. And then putting these two things together, in total, we call this the monetary approach to the exchange rate. So we have the idea of arbitrage, and arbitrage can take place not just in international financial markets, which we have seen previously, that leads traders to shift their funds between different locations, let's say London and New York, and to take advantage of different interest rates and the, if you like, prices in different countries. But we can also talk about prices of goods rather than assets such as the exchange rate. And you can express prices of goods in different countries. So think about it, a certain good, let's say a banana or an apple or an orange. And the theory here is the LOOP, the law of one price. So the law of one price suggests that if you have a good in one country, let's say an apple in one country, and the identical good in another country, it should be the case, if the law of one price holds, that the price of the good in the home country relative to the foreign country should be equal to one another once you express this foreign price in the domestic currency. So once you convert the price of, let's say, the apple in Japan to dollars using the exchange rate. So applying this to the if you like, several goods or to the entire set of goods in a country, we call this the theory of purchasing power parity. So purchasing power is how much your wealth will translate into goods. So you can translate your wealth into goods, and this is the purchasing power of your money, of your wealth. And if it is equal in two different locations, let's say home and abroad, then you have parity equality. So if I have, let's say, an income that I earn it in US dollars, and I can ask how is that nominal income translated into real income in terms of translated into goods? How many apples can I buy with it? If I can buy 100 apples in the United States, the theory of purchasing power parity suggests that once I translate that to the foreign location, I should be able to buy the same amount of goods if purchasing power parity holds. Not just for a single good, but for many goods. So in the most basic case, the assumptions behind this theory of purchasing power parity is suggesting that when you want to trade between two different locations, goods trade that is, let's say trade in apples or oranges, there is frictionless trade, meaning that the transaction costs, the transport costs, etc., can be neglected. They are marginalized or marginal. We start with a single good, and this is relating to the law of one price, and then move to a basket of goods and then examine purchasing power parity. So the law of one price suggests that in the absence of trade frictions, assumption number 1, under free competition, assumption number 2, and flexible prices, assumption number 3, goods that are identical, that are sold in different locations, should be expected to sell for the same price. They should cost the same. Once you express these identical goods in the same currency. So this law of one price for good G is expressed as follows. The relative price should be equal to 1, and the relative price here is defined as Q superscript G. There's the relative price of good G in Europe versus the United States. And this is equal, so this is defined by the following ratio. So a relative price is typically a ratio, as a relation. So we should expect a numerator and a denominator on the right-hand side. And on the right-hand side, we can see a numerator and the denominator. So starting with the denominator, this is the price of the good G in dollars in the United States at home. Then the numerator is the price of the same good, the identical good G, also expressed in dollars, but this time bought in Europe. So this is called the European price of good G expressed in dollars. Now, you can see that this is the price of the good G bought in Europe and on the right hand side, this is the price of the good G bought in the USA. If you want, you can add A to highlight that this is the location in which the price of the good is being bought. Now, the exchange rate dollar euro is multiplied by the price of good G bought in Europe, because the price of the good bought in Europe is expressed in, you guessed it right, euros. So to convert euros into dollars, we use the exchange rate dollar euro. Now, you can ask yourself, why is it the case that the exchange rate is expressed such that it is multiplied by the price of the good bought in Europe? And if you remember, the exchange rate here we have defined as, say, X dollars for 1 euro. Now, when we multiply this times this price, the price of the good, let's say an apple in Europe, this price, let's say, would be, if you want to make it easy, it would be a number such as 1 euro or 2 euro, etc. So let's say it would be 2 euro. In blue, I'm writing down a euro sign, 2 euro. Now, let's assume the exchange rate is 5. So X is 5. This would suggest that the European price of goods of the good G in dollar is $5 divided by 1 euro multiplied by 2 euro. Now, if you divide 2 euro by 1 euro, note, and this is extremely important to notice, that the unit of the denominator and the numerator is the same. So if you have 2 kilos divided by 1 kilo, what you have is just a number 2 without any unit. So what is the ratio of 2 kilo to 1 kilo? It is 2, a factor of 2. You have no unit behind it. So that's why it is important to notice that the exchange rate is fitting in the definition of the relative price such that the unit euro will drop out. And the result will be just 5 times 10 sorry, 5 times 2, 5 times 2, and the unit is dollar. So 5 times 2 is equal to 10. So this would be this expression. The price of the apple in Europe, once you convert it into dollars, is $10. Assuming these numbers. Now, for the law of one price to hold, it needs to be the case that the denominator needs to be equal to the numerator. So it would suggest that if the price of the good sold in different locations should be equal, the identical goods sold in different locations must sell for the same price when expressed in a common currency. It would suggest that the US price of the good G in dollars should also be $10. This would lead the law of one price to hold, and the relative price on the left-hand side, Q, G, US, A, Euro, Europe, would be equal to 1. So the relative price of 1 would suggest that the price of the good in one location is exactly equal to the price of the same good in another location once you express it in the same good in the same currency. And this would suggest that this good has one price across different locations. That's why it's called the law of one price. And the law of one price pertains to a single good. Now, PPP, purchasing power parity, is exactly the same idea, just that it is more general. It is more demanding because it requires that a bundle of goods has the same price across different locations. And looked at it in another way, you can rephrase this purchasing power parity, which we'll come to in a second, as saying that your money should have the same purchasing power whether or not you buy your apples, bananas, oranges, etc. in the United States, or if you buy it in Europe or another location. Your money should have the same purchasing power. It should be able to obtain a parity that is an equal amount of goods, a basket of goods in any location if purchasing power parity holds. And again, note that the assumptions are that we have absence of trade frictions, free competition, and price flexibility, which can be relaxed later on. But for now, this is the assumption, and this will build up purchasing power parity from starting with one good under the law of one price and then moving on to many goods under PPP. So the law of one price can be rearranged. You assume that Q is equal to 1, QG US Europe is equal to 1, and then you can rearrange the equation on the previous side. Note that I've assumed that law of one price to hold, which sets the left-hand side of the equation on the previous slide equal to 1, and then we can rearrange the equation, and we can then rearrange it once more, and it will suggest that the exchange rate is equal to the ratio of the good prices in two different countries. So if the law of one price holds, we can back out what should expected to be the exchange rate between the two countries. As mentioned previously, purchasing power parity is the same idea. We just drop the superscript G. Now we have a basket of goods, and this basket of goods has a price level P Europe in Europe and P US in United States. And if the relative price level is equal to 1, purchasing power parity holds. And this is called absolute PPP because we are talking about the levels of the price of this basket of goods. The real exchange rate is the relative price of the two baskets. So the real exchange rate is the rate at which US baskets can be exchanged for a European basket. So the simple exchange rate that we looked at in the previous lecture, simple E, is a nominal concept, not adjusting for differences in price. The real exchange rate is a real concept. It suggests that how is your wealth or your money translated into goods tradable for goods in another country. So in other words, if I can buy 100 apples and let's say 100 oranges and 100 bananas in the United States with my money, how much can I trade this for in the foreign country? How much does it exchange for in a foreign country? And if it is exactly equal to 100 apples and 100 bananas and 100 oranges, then the purchasing power is equal across two countries, such that this basket of goods exchanges for the same, if you like, amount of different goods inside the basket in the foreign country. So a rise of the real exchange rate Q is a real depreciation, because it suggests that home goods are needed more to be exchanged for foreign goods. So this suggests that the home purchasing power has become weaker, has fallen, has lost in value. That's why we call that a depreciation, a real depreciation. Previously, we talked about a nominal depreciation because what we are considering to buy is a foreign currency. And now we are considering to buy goods where the, if you like, fall in the exchange rate would suggest that the home currency has fallen in value. Vice versa for the real exchange rate rise. For the real exchange rate fall. This is the second point here. A fall means a real appreciation. So a fall is a real appreciation, and a rise a real depreciation. PPP, purchasing power parity, is very useful because once you have the real exchange rate Q equal to 1, it suggests that purchasing power is at parity. Now, if Q is below than 1, then the dollar is said to be strong and overvalued. And on the flip side, we say that the euro is undervalued. So when euro is undervalued, it always means that the dollar is overvalued. It's always a flip side. So similarly, when a country criticizes another country for a currency, its currency, to be undervalued, it means that on the flip side, viewed from the home country, its currency is overvalued. Naturally, we can talk also about Q being above 1 when the US dollar is to be undervalued and the euro is overvalued, according to this equilibrium exchange rate pinned down by PPP. Why is it called an equilibrium exchange rate? Because we assume that arbitrage will make the purchasing power equal across two locations. Otherwise, there's possibility for making money off goods arbitrage. It is moving and shifting goods around, buying and selling them, buying them at a low price and selling them at a high price. Note that there is a difference between a currency being undervalued versus a currency being depreciating. Depreciating is just a change in the exchange rate. For instance, the nominal exchange rate. If the nominal exchange rate rises, the exchange rate, the home currency, falls in value. So a rise means a depreciation. Undervalued or overvalued is not so much a statement about a change or a direction, that is the exchange rate going up or down, but it is a statement about if the level of the current exchange rate is high or low compared with the equilibrium implied by goods markets being in equilibrium. And goods markets being in equilibrium means that there is no goods market arbitrage possible. And if that is the case, it must mean that PPP holds. So if my purchasing power is at parity in two locations, in home and abroad, I do not want to do arbitrage. I do not want to buy low and sell high in the goods market, which means that there's no arbitrage opportunity left and PPP holds. However, if this equilibrium is not holding, then it could be the case that the currency is either valued at a higher or lower level compared with Q being equal to 1. So undervalued and overvalued is a statement about the equilibrium exchange rate versus, on the other hand, a depreciation or a appreciation is just a change in the value without necessarily talking about if this leads to more or less undervaluation or overvaluation. So for example, you can have a currency that is undervalued, and when it is appreciating, an undervalued currency becomes less undervalued. It might approach its PPP implied equilibrium exchange rate level. So same thing as before with the law of one price, we can rearrange PPP. So again, we assume that Q of the basket of goods US, Europe is equal to 1. And this is when absolute PPP holds, because we're talking about price levels. We rearrange this, and then we have an equation that suggests that the exchange rate is equal to the ratio of prices. So the purchasing power parity principle suggests that the exchange rate at which two currencies trade equals their relative price levels of the two countries. Now, this is the first part of the monetary approach to the exchange rate. Price levels pin down the exchange rate. And this link is provided by the theory of purchasing power parity. This is the first part of the monetary approach to determining what is the exchange rate, because there is another part that is still missing. Is the question is, well, if the exchange rate is determined by the price level, what then determines the price level? And for this, we add the monetary theory, suggests that money, supply and demand, and monetary policy will set and impact the price level. So the inputs of the model are the variables that need to be known. They're exogenous. Exogenous meaning exogenous. Genos means created. And exo means outside, created outside the model, exogenous, or sometimes pronounced as exogenous. So exogenous variables are variables that are determined or pinned down outside of the model. We take them as given within the context of this theory. So you have the price level and the foreign level. Under PPP, we just look at the data. What are the price levels in the US and Europe? This theory does not provide, this model does not provide what pins down the purchasing power parity in terms of where the price levels are coming from. We just take them as given. We take these price levels as given, put them in the model of PPP, this equation that you see in the previous slide, more specifically the ratio of the two price levels, and note which price level of which country is in the numerator and which price level is in the denominator. Make sure that you closely study if the price level of the US is in the denominator or in the numerator. If you need to, go back a slide and make sure that you understand why the price level of one country is in the denominator and not in the denominator. And taking these price levels as given, then we can pin down the exchange rate, which is the result of the model. That is the endogenous variable. That is the variable that is pinned down inside. It is generated inside genus, like Genesis. Endo, inside the model. So now we move on from absolute PPP to relative PPP. So absolute PPP is about the price level. When we allow for the change in the price level, we talk about relative PPP. So the change in the price level, as you know, is the definition of inflation. Prices rise, prices fall. This is inflation or deflation. Now we take the absolute PPP equation and express it in changes. And the result is relative PPP. The change, the percentage change, or the rate of change of the exchange rate is equal to the rate of change of depreciation in home. This is the definition of the left-hand side of PPP. Then we move on to express the right-hand side also in changes, which is in rates of change, which is what we do in the next slide. So the right-hand side is a rate of change of the ratio of the two price levels. And this is expressed as the change in prices in the US divided by the base minus the equivalent for Europe. And the ratio of inflation in the United States is expressed as pi US minus pi Europe. Putting these two things together, the left and the right-hand side of absolute PVP, we obtain relative PVP, which suggests that the rate of depreciation of the nominal exchange rate is equal to the difference in inflation between home and abroad. Now, notice here, this should be Europe. The change in prices in Europe, and that is subtracted from the change in prices in the United States. And this is relative PVP, and it applies that the rate of depreciation of the nominal exchange rate is the difference between the inflation rates in the two countries. Now, this monetary approach to the exchange rate, first part, PVP, is called a long-run determination. And that is the case because two things, primarily. There's other factors, but two things we can mention here. First, prices move slowly. Prices do not adjust very quickly because goods market arbitrage takes time. So if there is a profit opportunity by shifting and if you like buying goods at a low price and selling them at a high price in a different location, you need to shift those goods across borders. By shipping takes sometimes 2-3 months. So it is not a short run determination. But when we look at the long run, that is, we take data very long, over long periods of time, rate of depreciation between 75 and 2005, and plot that against the inflation differential, the line, 45-degree line, is very closely fitting the points that are coming from the data. So the data are the rate of exchange of depreciation against the US dollar and the inflation differential against the United States over the long run for a sample of over 80 countries. So it suggests that the, if you like, PVP is a good theory, empirically speaking, for the very long run, where exchange rates should go by taking account the change in prices over time, over very long periods of time. So UIP, the uncovered interest parity, was not so much supported to be useful for the short run. And for the long run, we use PVP to pin down the exchange rate, and this is supported by the data. Here's another piece of evidence, which is posting the relative price level of the US and the exchange rate. And you know from absolute PVP that they should be equal to another. And you can see that they're equal at some points, okay, but not throughout. So at periods or points in time, absolute PVP does not hold. But if you take the, if you like, the trend, they move in the same direction. So that's why the PVP theory, relative and absolute PVP, do not hold in the short run. So in, I feel like along the time, that we move from 1970 to 2010. But in the long run, it's suggested that the relative price level is related to the exchange rate. So relative PVP is supported by the data in the long run. But in the short run, it is not a helpful guide. So for instance, if you are here in 1982 or 1981 and you think that the PVP theory will pin down the exchange rate, then you'll have an unpleasant surprise because you see a huge and lasting difference in the relative price level and the exchange rate. But in the long run, if you are here and then or here and you look forward in the very long run, if the relative price level is falling, you can expect that the exchange rate also to fall. So we can ask, if PVP does not hold in the short run, how quick or slow do the data converge to the levels implied by PVP? And approximately half of any deviation from PVP still remains 4 years afterwards. So this is a 4-year half-life of deviations from PVP. And this is useful for forecasting real exchange rates in the long run. So if the real exchange rate is under or overvalued, we can say that PVP does not hold, because if relative PVP were to hold, the exchange rate is simply the inflation differential. Now, we can adjust this and we can use the evidence from the previous slide that suggests that the real exchange rate and the convergence speed will suggest that any deviation from PVP should be reduced to half after around 4 years. So even though in the medium run, PVP is not a good guide, except for the long run, we can still use this evidence on the average time it takes for the deviation to be removed. So when we ask what explains the deviation of the data from PVP, we note that there are assumptions behind purchasing power parity, and some of these assumptions might not be very useful, as they might not be approximated by reality. So number one is that there could be very large transaction costs. In reality, transaction costs are not negligible, but might be sizable. And they include not just transportation costs, but also tariffs, duties, shipping delays, and meeting regulatory legal requirements, and so on. Then second, some of the goods in the basket that makes up the price level in a country might be not at all traded. Think of haircuts, which is a form of a service, or goods that are just not traded, full stop, because they might be extremely heavy, or the transaction costs are infinitely high. And if they are included in the basket that determines the price level in a country, so typically we talk about inflation in the United States or in the UK and China being determined by CPI, Consumer Price Index, CPI. And this CPI is reflective of the typical goods that the typical median household is consuming. Of course, there are goods and services in there that are not tradable. So to expect that the price level of this good this good basket will be equalized once expressed in the same currency should not be realistic, because some of these cannot be arbitraged. So a haircut, for example, that is extremely cheap in China will have no competition from abroad if it is even cheaper there, because there's certain transaction costs involved if you would like to have that service in another country. Either you have to fly there or you have to fly the workers in. So some of these are not examples of non-traded goods that should us expect, or should us lead us to expect that PPP does not necessarily have affirmation in the data. Next, competition might not be perfect. There might be imperfect competition, and we've seen this in the increasing returns to scale model. It could be naturally in the, if you like, structure of the technology in a sector that there's natural economies of scale and increasing returns to scale, which make perfect competition not likely. And there could also be legal obstacles, such that you cannot necessarily arbitrage goods, maybe even in the same sector, let's say cars, because a firm has market power. Although it is a car, but there is little arbitrage opportunity, as the brand value makes consumers be subject to pricing power of the firm, such that there is no undifferentiated goods competition possible. So this allows firms to charge different prices, not just across brands, but also across countries, as consumers might not be able to switch to competitors. And if they want to import it from another country, then this might be, for example, legally restricted by the company, such that there cannot be, if you like, a perfectly competitive market within that sector. And fourthly, you have price stickiness. So we assume price flexibility, that prices are able to adjust, but they might not be adjusting quickly enough or flexibly to changes in market conditions, say because of tradition or other menu costs, where, for example, it takes time to change the prices on goods, or just because people are used to these prices and they are not willing to change them quickly enough for PPP to be true in the data. So the Economist magazine looks at the Big Mac index, which is actually not so much a test for PPP, because PPP is looking at a basket of goods, but more like a test of the law of one price. And if Q, the relative price of the single good Big Mac across different locations, is 1, then the law of one price holds. And the Big Mac index is Q minus 1. And following, we look at the Big Mac index across different locations. Here you can see that there are different locations and Big Mac prices in local currency and then converted to US dollars in column 2. And the exchange rate implied by actually not so much the PPP. So it's a little bit misleading. So I think it would be better to call it implied by the law of one price, is then denoted in column 3. And the actual price in column 4 and the difference in column 5. And you can see that there is an undervaluation against the dollar in these locations. And for another set of regions and locations, you can see that in some cases there's, like Norway, a overvaluation. Now we come to the second part of this lecture, which is looking at how actually prices get determined. So we will see that the monetary theory of the price level is determining the price level by reference to the money demand and money supply and the equilibrium in the money market. Money has three functions. It is a store of value. You can keep your wealth in it over time as the money does not deteriorate in its form, be it in coins or paper notes, or extremely little, assuming that there is no inflation. Then you have a unit of account, which is the unit in which prices are quoted, and the function of a medium of exchange, which is the intermediate goods that people use to exchange their goods instead of barter. There are different measures of money, broad and narrow money. And starting from the black line, narrow money, or the monetary base, is currency in circulation. And then when you add private bank cash reserves into it, then you have the base money, M0. Then you have narrow money or broad money, and the broader it gets, the more you include. So the more liquid it gets, the measure of money, the broader the definition of money. So if you not just include paper coins and notes and cash in bank reserves, but also include deposits at banks and saving and time deposits, etc., then the amount of money you can count is much larger. And you can see this in the line shaded in blue. The supply of money is to some extent controlled by the central bank. This is a very simple assumption. So the simplifying assumption that the central bank indirectly controls the level of M1, a form of narrow money. That is currency in circulation, demand deposits, and liquid deposits. In reality, of course, the supply of money is, if you like, impacted by a host of factors. Not just the demand for money that will impact the supply of money, but also the creation of bank deposit money by commercial banks. So after looking at the supply of money, we look at the demand of money. The demand of money here is a function of income, nominal income. So real income is Y, and multiplied by the price is nominal income. So that's the amount, if you like, the dollar amount of income that you have. And you can ask how much of that money, that income, how much of that money type of income, or income measured in dollars, you would like to hold in the form of money, that is a very liquid form of wealth. And this equation suggests that a constant fraction, think about the fraction as, for example, being 30%, could be also 60%, 90%, 10%, but we assume that could be some fraction of your normal income is held in the form of money, and the rest you hold in other forms. So a rise in income means that you have a higher demand for transactions, and this results in a higher demand for money. Next, we simply rewrite the equation to take the price level on the left-hand side, and this is defining the demand for nominal money. Let's say nominal money is $100, $150, and divided by the price level, which is suggesting how much purchasing power does that money have that you have in your, for example, in your pocket. So in equilibrium, money supply and money demand are equal. So MD is equal to M, and M here doesn't have the subscript S, we just leave it off. And then we have the equation M equals L times PY, and we can revert this into M divided by P equals L bar Y. This is the equilibrium in the money market. Now we can rewrite it and take the variable M on the right-hand side and put the variable P on the left-hand side. And this is just an expression of the price level from the previous slide that yields us this equation for the price level. Now we have the same thing for the foreign country, Europe. And this is called the fundamental equation of the monetary model of the price level. It suggests that the money market, demand and supply for money, will pin down the price level and therefore also rates of inflation in each country. So this is a theory for the long run because we assume that prices are sufficiently flexible, or we have a long enough time horizon such that prices can adjust to put the money market in equilibrium. So for the monetary model of the price level, it gives us the money supply will determine the price level. Of course, next to the money supply, there will also be income that will be a variable feeding into the price level. So this is the monetary theory of the price level that looks at the equilibrium of the money market, and that is setting the price level such that we get the equilibrium price level at home and abroad. What we do now is we take absolute PPP and then plug in the price level as determined by the monetary theory. So we have the price levels that are being determined by the money supply as well as the income. And this is inserted. So P here, price level is this, M divided by L times Y. And similarly for Europe. And how the price level determines the exchange rate. This is PPP. And PPP is this part of the equation. and we feed the monetary theory of the price level into the right-hand side, and this will yield us, for the right-hand side, this term, and then we can rewrite this further into this term. So it would suggest that how to read this equation is the exchange rate is equal to the ratio of price levels, and the ratio of price levels then is determined by the relative nominal money supplies divided by real relative money demands. Now we apply this model. So now what we are doing is we have the exchange rate being determined by the price level, and the price level determined by the money market equilibrium. And now we apply this model. We can ask, well, what happens if the US money supply increases and everything else is constant? So what is the effect of a change in money supply in the US and everything else is constant? We can ask, what is the effect on the exchange rate? And you can see that this is causing the exchange rate to increase when US money supply increases, everything else being equal, all the other variables not being changed. Similarly, you can ask what happens if real income increases in the United States, and you can see that the denominator increases, means that the whole, if you like, expression decreases, and this suggests that the exchange rate falls. So it's very important here to note that the equation on the right-hand side is comprising all of this part. So these equal signs are just rewriting the expression of the ratio of price levels. And this comes from the monetary theory of the price level. Next, the US money supply can be defined as a growth rate. So growth rate here is simply the change in the variable over time from xt1 relative to xt divided by the base xt. And you can define the growth rate for any variable x for the money supply, mu UST, and for the growth rate of real income, G UST. So this suggests that you can express the growth rate of prices as the difference between the growth in money supply growth rate minus the growth rate of real income. And similarly for the foreign country, the European economy. So this is relating the price level, the left-hand side, to, on the right-hand side, money supply and growth, money supply and income growth. So this is exactly the same idea behind the fundamental equation of the price level, where you have on the left-hand side price and on the right-hand side income and money. Here we just express it in growth rates. It's nothing new, it's just that we changed the variable definition, and it should still hold. This monetary theory of the price level now expressed in changes, rates of change, expressed in growth rates of the price level. So it suggests that when money growth is higher than income growth, then we have inflation. If money grows more quickly than GDP, you have inflation. And you can think this for various episodes in recent economic history where money has grown tremendously. If it is growing faster than income growth, then just according to this theory, you would expect there to be inflation. Naturally, there's many other factors that are leading to inflation other than the difference between money and income growth. But it is the first shot at the nexus between money and output or income or GDP, which are all equivalent according to the circular definition of GDP. And the idea here is that inflation is the outcome of money growth exceeding GDP. So if there is high growth of money, it's fine if it's matched by high GDP growth, because GDP growth, you can think intuitively, means that there's more transaction demand, people are getting richer, therefore they have higher demand for money, such that the price does not need to be adjusting to keep the money market in equilibrium because demand is increasing. And you can do this, so we have done this so far mathematically, and you can do the work on the intuition and consolidate your understanding by looking at supply and demand for money graphically as well in the market for money supply demand curve figure. So we now move on to relative PPP. So relative PPP is here on the left-hand side. It's the rate of depreciation of the nominal exchange rate that is equal to the inflation differential. And this is set down by PPP. And the right-hand side is provided by the monetary theory of the price level, where inflation is pinned down by the difference in growth rate between money and income in both the US and abroad. And you can rewrite this to the differential in nominal money supply growth rates in both locations. The idea behind it is that if the United States has a monetary policy that is loose than the rest of the world, so meaning faster money growth, not funnier money growth, faster money growth, the dollar will depreciate more rapidly, ceteris paribus, all other variables held constant. And if the economy grows faster in the long run, the dollar will appreciate more rapidly, all else equal. And you can check this by adjusting the variables in the previous slide's equation. we can apply this to analyze the effects of monetary policy on the exchange rate. So we can ask, if it is the case that prices are flexible and purchasing power parity holds, now let's adjust some variables, and then in terms of the money supply or its growth rate, and see what is the effect of, for example, Benjamin Bernanke, Janet Yellen, or Jerome Powell, that is the current and the previous chairs of the US Federal Reserve, or Christine Lagarde, or Mario Draghi, etc., the heads of the ECB, and the previous heads, or Kuroda, the head of the Japanese central bank, and so on. So if there is a change in monetary policy by these central banks, what is the effect on the exchange rate? And this is what we do now. We have cases 1 and 2. Case 1 is a one-time increase in the supply of money. So a temporary increase, a transitory increase in money. Case 2 is a increase in the rate of growth, which permanently raises the rate of money growth. So a transitory, temporary change, number 1. Number 2, a permanent change. And we take these in turn. So for the first case, a temporary increase in the level of the money supply of 10%. The result is as follows. Real money balances remain constant because real income is constant. The previous two results suggest that the price level and money supply must move in the same proportion such that there's an increase in 10% of the price level. PPP then implies that the exchange rate and price level must move in the same proportion so that there is a 10% increase in the exchange rate. So the result here is that a 10% increase in the money supply will lead to a 10% increase in the exchange rate. So if this one-time increase starts to be taken back, so if this one-time increase is indeed temporary, you have a decrease in the money supply by 10% and a decrease in the exchange rate by 10%. So this one-time increase can be temporary, but it could also be permanent. So 2, an increase in the rate of money growth. So money supply is growing at a constant rate. So the rate is constant, it doesn't change over time. Let's say it's always growing at the rate mu. Say mu is 5%, for instance. And then afterwards, it grows by some change in u. Let's say plus 2%. So instead of growing at 5% every year, it now grows at 7% every year. Real money balances, M divided by P, remain constant as before. The previous two statements then imply that the price level and money supply must move in the same proportion such that M and P are a constant multiple of each other. So then purchasing power parity implies that E is a constant multiple of P, and E and P move in the same proportion. So growth rate of mu before the policy change at T, and then growth rate of mu plus some delta, so 5 plus 2%, for instance. The real money balances at home do not change. So recall from previously, slide 29, that the equilibrium in the market for money is that M divided by P equals L times Y. So the right-hand side, L times Y, the income and the fraction of income held as money hasn't changed. So the right-hand side hasn't changed. Therefore, the left-hand side, M divided by P, also should not change. So for this to continue to hold, something must give. Because if indeed M divided by P should not change due to L and Y not changing, when M increases, but M divided by P should not change, what must happen to P if M increases and M divided by P should remain constant? The answer is, you guessed it, P also needs to rise when M rises. If M rises by 10%, then P rises by 10% and M divided by P is unchanged. So we have this here that indeed P rises by the same amount or fraction of growth rate by delta mu. Rate of inflation increases by the same change as money growth rate changed. The result is that the home exchange rate, E, rises by the rate of growth of money change by mu, delta mu. So PVP, and assuming that the foreign price level does not change, imply that the exchange rate will follow a similar path than compared with the domestic price level. So E also grows at the new rate mu plus delta mu. So this link here is pinned down by PVP. And the link between money supply, money balances, and the price level is determined by the monetary theory of the price level. So the point of this is a very important result, is namely that we can analyze changes in money supply and monetary policy, central bank action on the foreign exchange market. So if we look at evidence for this monetary approach that relates prices or change in prices to the money growth rate, so that M will impact P or changes in M will impact P, then we see that the monetary approach has huge backing in the data. And this is a long-term finding because we look at very long periods. So that's why it's called a long run theory of what is the exchange rate. So inflation and money growth are related, and they're related closely. So next we can ask, is the money growth rate and the exchange rate related? So that is what we've seen in the few slides before, about 2 slides before, namely that M impacts changes in E. And here's the money growth rate differential and the rate of depreciation. And we see that this is also strongly supported by the data. Now, note that this is a differential in money growth because the exchange rate is a rate of exchange between two countries in terms of their currencies. So therefore, we need to take the difference between the money growth rate in one country minus the growth rate of money in the other country. That is very important to keep in mind. while PVP holds in the long run, there is an exception that in the short run it can hold if indeed prices are changing rapidly. So the problem why PVP doesn't hold in the short run is because prices do not change quickly enough, or they don't adjust quickly enough to meet the prediction of the PVP theory. However, this is different in hyperinflations. Hyperinflations are episodes of countries that are going through very rapid and huge changes in prices, sometimes as big as 50% per month. So that implies a doubling of prices every 51 days. And when we look at the data, we can see that actually PVP does hold in the very small subset of cases in the short run when countries experience hyperinflation. And we look at this in the following. So here, if we take hyperinflations, which is just a few years, let's say Hungary 45, 46, Zimbabwe 07, 08, China prior to the People's Republic of China being founded, 45 to 49, and that would, for instance, Germany, Zaire, etc., all relatively short periods of just a few years. Then in this kind of short run, the PVP is very, very closely aligned with the data. So the multiplicative change in the FX rate is very much matching the multiplicative change in the price level. So exchange rates and price level changes are closely related. And this is the theory of PVP, and this holds in the short run, but it tends to be only for hyperinflations, but not for normal circumstances. So it suggests that the PVP is not a useful guide for predicting exchange rates in the short run, except in the rare circumstances of hyperinflation. So finally, what we do is we generalize the model by letting the demand for money be not just a constant fraction of income, but rather let the demand for money be also impacted by the opportunity cost of holding money. So the opportunity cost of holding money is what you forego by holding your wealth in the form of money. And the alternative form of holding your wealth is putting it in a deposit, for example, at the bank, where you could earn a rate of return in the form of the interest rate, which would suggest that the higher the opportunity cost of money, that is, the higher the interest rate, the lower the demand for money. So liquidity here means money being one of the most liquid forms of wealth, is lower when interest rates are higher. There's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and liquidity demand. The model can be generalized by allowing the liquidity part of the money demand function to be a function of the interest rate. And it is a decreasing function, meaning that if the interest rate rises, the liquidity demand falls. And we can rewrite this to take the level of prices on the left-hand side, and that is similar to the basic model we looked at previously. Graphically speaking, the demand for real money balances is rising when there's a fall in the opportunity cost of holding money. The opportunity cost is the nominal interest rate, which is what you forego by holding your wealth in the form of money. As here you can think of money as cash, bank notes, paper notes, and coins. And a decrease in the nominal interest rate therefore causes an increase in the real money demand. Now, for the same amount, if you look at the right-hand side, for the same amount of interest, level of interest, the demand for money will be higher when you have a higher level of income. So if you have a rise in income from Y1 to Y2, then for the same level of the interest rate, money demand will be higher. And this is here signified as the red line, where income now is Y2, whereas previously it was Y1. In this equation, we see the demand for money being equal to the supply of money. And you can notice this by M no longer having the subscript MD, as in equilibrium, the money supply is equal to the demand for money. And this is why you have M instead of MD on the left-hand side. So it's the same equation as before, just M replacing MD, because we are now looking at the equilibrium in the money market. Now, then with these two relationships, the one that we studied in this chapter, purchasing power parity, and the previous one, uncovered interest parity from the previous chapter, we can derive a result that has implications for open economy macro, which is we take these two theories, PPP and UIP, which are depicted below, and you can already see that the left-hand side of PPP has the expected rate of dollar depreciation, and the right-hand side, which is UIP, also has the expected rate of dollar depreciation, and you can set these two equal to one another, such that the differential in the interest rate should be equal to the expected inflation differential. And we'll see this on the following slide. Here we take the equation from the previous slide, which is a application of PPP and UIP jointly, and then rewrite it to have on the left-hand side the difference between the interest rate and the inflation rate in the US, and on the right-hand side the same thing for Europe. And we can define the difference between the interest rate and the inflation rate as the real interest rate. So recall that once you adjust a nominal interest rate by prices, you have the real interest rate. And PPP and UIP together then imply equation 3.9, which is that real interest rates are equal in both locations. So what this means is that arbitrage in goods markets, if there's arbitrage taking place and this leads to no arbitrage being available afterwards, which is PPP, and arbitrage in financial markets for traders to move around to take advantage of asset price differences in terms of the currency, the foreign exchange market. These two together, once you have no arbitrage in the financial market in terms of foreign exchange and no arbitrage opportunity left in terms of uncovered interest parity, so UIP and PPP together, these two equilibrium conditions are sufficient for in the long run, because we are dealing here with a prediction that is based on PPP, to result in real interest rates across countries to be equal. What this suggests is that the real interest rates across countries, which is the cost of capital, is equal across the countries that we are talking about, home and foreign. We can rewrite the result from the previous slide, noticing that all countries have then the same interest rate, and we can just call that R star. And then R star can be treated as an exogenous variable that cannot be affected by any central bank or policymaker in a particular country. And then what we can do is we can look at the Fisher effect again that we've seen on the previous slide, and then see that the interest rate is equal to the real interest rate plus inflation, and the real interest rate is just given. So it would suggest, this is a conceptual point, that the interest rate in a country is determined, the nominal interest rate in a country is primarily determined by its expected inflation. So it would suggest that interest rates would be high if the expected inflation rate is high, but if the nominal interest rate, which you know, for example, in the UK is the so-called bank rate of the Bank of England, in the United States is called the FFR, the federal funds rate, the central interest rate set by the central bank. If it is low, according to this analysis, this is due to expectation inflations in the United States being low. The evidence for the Fisher effect is depicted here in figure 3.12. The inflation differential is plotted against the interest rate differential, and it is the case that they closely match each other. Similar to PPP, the real interest rate parity is a long-run phenomena because it builds on PPP. It is UIP plus PPP together, and you can see here that over time, the real interest rate differential between different countries is, if you like, zero at points in time, but not throughout. Now what we do is we just insert the more general form of the liquidity term, such that on the right-hand side you have L as a function of the interest rate for both home and abroad. And now what we do is we look at what happens if there is an increase in the rate of money growth, and examine how this more general and slightly more realistic model changes our predictions of the model, how monetary policy affects the exchange rate. Recall importantly that for this purpose, the nominal interest rate is pinned down by the inflation rate. This is something to bear in mind that we did not previously have to consider in the simple model, but now when inflation changes, it will impact the interest rate, and now that interest rate change will have an impact on L, and this will change qualitatively the result of the change in monetary policy on the exchange rate and will have very interesting implications. Similar to before, we have a change in the growth rate from mu to mu plus delta mu in the rate of money growth. Now, this causes an increase in inflation and the interest rate. Why is that? Well, as we know, a change in money supply will affect the price level. This is what we learned from the monetary theory of the price level. Everything else equal, if domestically there's an increase in the rate of money growth, then this will lead to an increase in inflation. So on the slide 36, equation 3.4 suggests that an increase in the money growth rate will lead to an increase in inflation. And the increase in inflation causes the interest rate to rise. Now, this second effect is from the Fisher effect. The interest rate is equal to the nominal interest rate I is equal to the real interest rate, the world interest rate, which cannot be affected by a country, given our assumptions of UIP and PPP, and is equal to the real interest rate R plus the rate of inflation. So if we were to write it down, the interest rate in a country is equal to R star, and let this be for the US, plus the inflation rate US pi. So if the inflation rate goes up, the interest rate rises. This is where we got this change from. A rise in the interest rate is due to a rise in inflation, and this is the result that we have obtained from the Fisher effect. And the rise in inflation, in turn, this has been obtained from the monetary theory of the price level, which suggests that money growth will impact inflation. And if you want to recall that, that is the inflation rate is equal to the rate of money growth minus the rate of real income. And I leave you to look up that equation on slide 36. Then finally, for the third part here, money balances fall. And recall for that purpose that the money market equilibrium is denoted by this equation. This is for the US, so you have to put subscripts for the US there. Now, when we have an increase in the money growth rate and we have a fall in the interest rate, sorry, that is an increase in the interest rate. This is from here. As the interest rate increases, we know that L is a negative function or inverse function of I, which suggests that L falls. So L, and therefore the whole right-hand side will fall. So it would suggest that also the left-hand side will need to fall, irrespective of M rising. That is why you have a real money balances drop. The left-hand side, M divided by P, is a real money balance variable. And how is this affected? You will see in the third subplot. So here we see that this is achieved by prices jumping up. And I'm rewriting this equation, writing it again. So when the right-hand side is falling because the interest rate is rising, which pushes down the factor L, the left-hand side is also falling. So although M is rising slowly, from T onwards, P is actually jumping up. So if P jumps up by this amount, you can actually have a fall on the left-hand side. So now note that M is indeed rising. However, it is rising after the time t. So after the time t, M is rising because the policy is a growth rate change. So the growth rate change will take place after the policy has been activated and announced. But at t, at the time of the announcement, the change in money hasn't happened yet because time needs to pass for money to have an increasing growth rate. So the part here where money is rising, this pertains to the future after time t. Therefore, if M is not changing at time t and prices are rising and prices are here in the denominator, it would then confirm that real money balances are indeed falling, and they are falling because prices jump. Because as of t, time period t, money supply in terms of its level hasn't changed. Only over time will it change. And then what happens is that after t, the money growth rate will be exactly equal to the price level growth rate, such that the left-hand side of this equation, M divided by P, will not change, as the right-hand side will also not change, as both the interest rate will remain fixed at the higher level, and the real money balances level will be lower and stay at that lower level afterwards. And there will be no change in the real money balances because money and prices will rise at the same rate. Now, the impact of this will be seen on the exchange rate in the next slide. So here we see that there is a increase in the exchange rate, and there is a immediate jump of the exchange rate. So a rise in the exchange rate means a depreciation, a fall in the home currency relative to the foreign currency. And then afterwards, the growth rate of the exchange rate will be mu plus delta mu. Now, over time, in terms of the growth rate change, this result is exactly equal to the result in the simple model, not in the general model. So in the simple model, which we looked at before, where L is just a constant and it is not a function of I, you have also the result that there's a growth rate change of the exchange rate. Now, the new finding here is when we look at how the money supply impacts the exchange rate, we see that once we allow liquidity to be a function of the interest rate, it is much more a complicated picture, because the announcement of and this is a very important point to bear in mind to understand and appreciate the difference in models from the simple to the general model. In the general model, the announcement of the central bank, be it Jerome Powell or Bernanke, Janet Yellen, etc., these kind of central bank governors, announcing that in the future, from time period T onwards, money will experience a growth rate that is higher, that is mu plus delta mu. At that point in time, at T, the policy has not yet kicked in. It has been announced, because you can see that from plot A, the money supply hasn't changed. It is still at the same level, and only in the future it will grow slowly over time at a higher growth rate. Now, when we allow for the general model, that is liquidity, to be a function of the interest rate, what happens is that the announcement of the policy has an immediate impact, even though the policy hasn't been implemented yet. It hasn't bitten yet the market. The anticipation thereof will have an immediate impact on the exchange rate. And it is an impact that is quite disruptive, because the exchange rate records a jump, a large, relatively speaking, depending on the announcement of money supply growth, a large jump in the exchange rate. And this is important because we have talked about the Fisher effect being, and I would like to recall that the interest rate in a country, here I've write it out as, for example, the United States, is equal to, the nominal interest rate is equal to the world interest rate, IUS equals R star, plus the inflation rate in the country, the expected inflation rate in the US. And this tiny letter here, E, lowercase e, is important because it is the expected inflation rate that is driving the immediate impact on the exchange rate. So if there's an announcement from the policymaker saying that in the future, from T onwards, money will grow at a higher rate, this will feed to the expected inflation rate, via the monetary theory of the price level. And then this higher rate of inflation will then feed into the interest rate and then feed through plot B and C, the home real money balances, the home price level. So when people expect a higher home inflation, the home price level actually will adjust and jump up immediately. And this is then resulting in the exchange rate rising. Now, what the point of this is to show that policies can have an immediate impact even if nothing has happened yet. The mere announcement and the expectation of a policy to take place in the future can have an immediate impact in the economy once we allow for expectations that take into account future changes in the economy to have a result and an immediate impact today. Now, this is very useful. Now, first, there is some critical comment in order. Naturally, you can ask, is it really possible for prices to adjust that quickly? The price level to jump by that much and instantaneously? There's a question mark about that. If we stretch the time frame, you can say that there might be an adjustment of prices that is relatively immediate, but it might not be as large as would be suggested by this model. Now, this is the first point, the caveat. Secondly, this model is very useful because later, this whole model, later it will show us the trade-offs of different policy regimes once we take the general model into consideration. The previous slide has shown that when monetary policy is active, it can have an immediate impact on the exchange rate, and this is done via inflation expectations. Now, the European Central Bank has a single mandate meaning here what it is responsible for and what it is mandated to do, which is price stability. In other words, inflation. The US Federal Reserve has a dual mandate. It's supposed to attach importance to price stability, that is inflation, as well as unemployment. So here on the slide, when it is speaking about the nation's economic policy being concerned with inflation within certain bounds, this applies very much to the European Central Bank and in some way also to the Federal Reserve, although the Federal Reserve has a larger mandate, a dual mandate, of also looking at unemployment, not merely at price stability or inflation. Now, to achieve such an objective requires that the policy makers are constrained somewhat in the long run, and this is sometimes referred to as normal anchors. So, as we've seen in the previous slide, if we take a more realistic model where expectations of future inflation can have a immediate impact on the interest rate today, this has a immediate effect on the exchange rate. So if monetary policymakers would like to adjust their money policy, then they either face the consequence of having an exchange rate that fluctuates, or they, for example, could be constrained by the politicians if they have to follow a mandate that mandates the central bank to control inflation. So this control could be anchored at a variable, and this is sometimes called the nominal anchor, that tries to bring inflation under control by putting some certain bounds on the monetary policy of a country. And sometimes also will control fiscal policy. And the type of anchor that is the focus of policymakers that they try to achieve, that is the target they're trying to achieve, is impacting what type of regime or monetary regime the economy is running. And you can either, for example, target the exchange rate, in which case you have a fixed exchange rate, or you can have a money supply target, which is the type of monetary policy that was and used to be pursued in the 1970s, 80s, and previously prior to the appearance of stagflation, the appearance of stagnation plus inflation. And then subsequently, most Western developed countries have adopted inflation targeting plus interest rate policy. But some other countries, including many developing countries, they focus on a fixed exchange rate to bring the nation's economic policy, if you like, under control. And we will look at these in the following. So a normal anchor in the form of an exchange rate target will set the rate of depreciation to 0. If you expect, for example, the exchange rate to not change, then it would suggest that if you want to have a fixed exchange rate by the rate of depreciation being 0, then home inflation will need to be equal to foreign inflation. This is implied by relative purchasing power parity. And the simple rule would be to set the rate of depreciation equal to a constant, and in many cases this will be 0 unless we have a crawling peg. So what you see here is something that we will look at, the impossibility or the triangle of impossibility, which means that if you want to have a fixed exchange rate, what you are giving up, the trade-off involved, is that you have to subsume your, if you like, economic policy at home, fiscal and monetary policy, to then achieve inflation that is equal to the foreign inflation level. So such that there's no runaway inflation at home when the exchange rate is set to be restricted or not to change at all. So in other words, once you want to fix one variable, you have to give up another variable. So once you want to fix E, you have to give up pi. Pi then will fluctuate depending on what the foreign inflation level is. This is a trade-off. If you want to fix one variable as a policymaker, then you have to give up and you cannot fix another variable. This is the idea of free lunch. In economics, there's no free lunch, that there's often costs involved in making choices. It's not like you can have two things without any cost. Another nominal anchor would be to anchor it on the money supply. And as I mentioned, this was used as a target for monetary policy in the past, whereby the money supply growth rate is set to a certain level. So, for example, growth rate of money supply should be 2% a year or thereabouts. And the trade-off involved here is that the real income growth can be unstable, so which suggests that in periods of high growth, inflation will be below the desired level. In periods of low growth, inflation will be above the desired level. So what is meant here is that once you want to fix mu, h, so the money supply growth rate at home, what you give up is inflation. Inflation, again, will be varying depending on GDP growth rate. So again, there's the trade-off. Once you want to fix one variable here, money supply growth rate, then you can't fix, or you do not have so much flexibility in fixing and adjusting the inflation rate. So finally, we have the nominal anchor in the form of inflation target plus interest rate policy. And here you want to fix the interest rate. And the Fish effect then suggests that the world interest rate will pin down your inflation rate, the expected inflation rate. So if you like, the Fish effect would say that home inflation is the home interest rate, nominal that is, minus the world interest rate. If the world interest rate is constant, then the average home nominal interest rate is stable. And if this is the case, inflation can be kept stable. But to target the nominal interest rate, this must be adjusted if the world real interest rate changes, as seems to be the case recently, and as we have seen in some previous figures that the real interest rate actually in the world changes over time. So it would suggest that once the world interest rate changes, your expected inflation rate also changes. So something always has to give. Once you want to pick one variable, and this is a very stark conceptualization of the point of the impossibility triangle, you have to give up focusing on another variable, and you have to let that float. So if you look at this equation, it would suggest that if the real interest rate in the world is constant, then inflation, the expectation of inflation would also be constant.